Eric, is this Commanders team ready to compete with Philly?
So we can certainly compete with anybody. Of course, the Philadelphia natives are going to reference that Jalen Hurts missed that second game or was injured during that second game.
Yeah.
So that win against the Eagles that the Commanders got that comeback win is a little bit diluted. And of course, we saw what happened in the NFC Championship game, and that cannot be discredited. But we got to be realistic here, right? Like the Philadelphia Eagles are one of the premier franchises in the National Football League, from their front office to their coaching staffs to how they've been drafting and operating their team for, at this point, almost basically 2 decades, right? So it's not to say that Washington, considering their turnaround has been only, a 24-month turnaround to get to a point of not just relevancy, but also just competency from a front office and coaching perspective. So, no diss to my favorite team, but we absolutely still have some work to do. But you can tell that we are, somewhat taking their approach. Adam Peters, of course, successful general manager, from Philadelphia, from San Francisco before coming to Washington. So he has the understanding what it takes to build a team that goes to the NFC Championship game or a Super Bowl, which he's now done with two different franchises. Washington Super Bowl hopefully is on the horizon, but we still are not as good as the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, I will say that when you have the better quarterback, that Jaden Daniels over Jalen Hurts, and that's not a slight to Jalen Hurts, that's just how good Jaden Daniels is, you're always going to put yourself into position to win football games. But from a player-for-player standpoint, the Eagles still do have the edge, but I do expect Washington to be more competitive in these games due to their increased firepower on offense. A lot of those games are also riddled with turnovers on both teams. Jaden Daniels, not a huge interception guy, but had a few. Washington had a couple of key fumbles from skilled players that led to momentum shifts, which also hindered their chances at making comebacks in those games. And as we know in the NFL, turnovers are a regressionary stat that cannot be predicted week in and week out. So I think the Commanders are definitely not 20 points worse than the Philadelphia Eagles in an NFC Championship game anymore. Though with that being said, they still have the Eagles to look up to, and they need to prove more that they can take on the Philadelphia Eagles. But all things considered, Washington set themselves up in a position to be more competitive against one of, if not the best teams, literally the reigning Super Bowl champions heading into this upcoming season.
What position groups, if any, do you think the Commanders have an advantage over Philly right now?
It's a tough question. It's quarterback. And again, that's not a slight to Jalen Hurts. We were just talking about how good Jaden Daniels is. Washington has that difference maker, though Jalen Hurts, of course, is a difference maker when he is on, as we've seen him show up in big game after big game throughout his career. So, again, this is not a biased Washington take or hating on Jalen Hurts. Great quarterback. JD5 still gets the nod. But outside of that, I think you could probably make the argument that Washington's cornerback room is better, with the Eagles being a little bit younger. But with that being said, since they were younger, you could expect them to maybe ascend a little bit better. But Washington now, as Mikey Sanders still is young, hopefully Lattimore is healthy this year and has a better issue with the system to help him play a little bit better. Jonathan Jones and Trey Amos, hopefully, Jones is probably plug and play as a veteran. I would expect him to have minimal issues unless Father Time caught up to him. But it's more like that Eagles are better across the board still, but we're still talking about, like, at this point, which is a massive upgrade for Washington, we're talking about, like, if Philly's here, like, Washington's, like, here. That gap being a lot more distinct as it was.
And on the opposite end of that, which position groups do you think are the furthest from competing with Philly? Is there one specific area that worries you?
The defensive line for Philadelphia, now they were not necessarily group, but they have absolute beasts up there, and especially the middle of the defensive line. But Washington, again, now with the drafting of Josh Connerly, the addition of Larry Tunsil, Sam Cosmi coming off of IL, hopefully around November from that torn ACL. Then, of course, Brandon Coleman, who as a rookie last year played a lot of quality stats. Hopefully Washington's interior offensive line now is a little bit stronger to protect against Philly. But the mismatch that Philly presents in the trenches has really prompted Washington to make a deal for a Larry Tunsil, and of course for protecting Jaden Daniels. So that is still something that's on my mind. Like, we need to make sure we actually see it in real time. Washington's offensive line continue to impress. And then when it comes to receiver, like I mentioned, Trey McLaurin's also is great. Deebo Samuel is not this number one guy. He's this gadget type player. And on the Philadelphia Eagles side, you have, Smith, who is as deadly of a two-headed wedge. I think that firepower for Philly is still in their favor, as well as like some of the like I guess less premium positions, like potentially like a CB. Of course, defensive line is premium, and that's massive. But all things considered, um, the Philadelphia Eagles still have more explosiveness on offense, and their defensive line is still going to be a staple of this team moving forward, which Washington needs to make sure they protect against.
Do you think the Eagles could see a Super Bowl hangover this season?
Absolutely, but with that being said, I as even a Commanders fan coming into last season, like I crowned the like my Super Bowl prediction heading into last season was the Philadelphia Eagles versus Kansas City Chiefs. So fortunately, what was spot on right there with my analysis, and even when the Eagles went through some growing pains in the beginning of the year, I a dead and defeated team. Um, from a roster perspective, of course, there's a lot of like other influences that could cause turmoil in a lot of roster
Mhm.
perspective. I expect the Eagles to not be a team that, like we saw the Niners went to the Super Bowl last year, lose, of course, injury, or 2 years ago, lose. Injuries pile up for them, which of course is a massive thing. But the Eagles hit massively by the injury bug to key players. I don't expect Philly to see a fall off. No, I expect them to continue one of the premier teams in the National Football League.
Thanks for watching this episode on the BetCanada channel. I have more Commanders content coming with Eric, so hit that subscribe button.